Chapter 30. Argentina, here we are. Remember, it's all an impression of deja vu. Buenos Aires, what a city, Dan exclaimed when he, Gustavo and Damianos returned to their hotel after a long walk downtown. If I thought Rome was grandiose or Boston most modern, I find Buenos Aires amazing.
Well, I'm certain your father felt the same when he and his brother Franco arrived in the mid-1900s, Damianos rejoined. After living in a village such as Castelnuovo, I am sure a big city like Buenos Aires might have opened their eyes. I think what is amazing to me, Gustavo put in, is the fact that half of the population seems to own a motor vehicle. Is that a sign of progress, or has it something to do with your standing in the community?
A little of both, I suspect, Dan answered for Damianos. When we went past the garage with the new Cadillac models and I talked to the owner, he told me that people around here want a comfortable and speedier means of transport these days. They were now sitting in the dining room of a posh hotel waiting for their meal to be served.
Yes, and I think the garage owner was right, Damianos rejoined. People are avid of progress all around the globe. Nations are coming out of the Dark Ages. Perhaps North and South America are at the forefront of progress, and since they are driven by a need to build a future for themselves after emigrating from Europe and elsewhere. We saw the same happening in Colombia, and it felt as if the entire nation was in need of growing up,
Gustavo remarked. But tell me, Damianos, why did my father and Uncle Franco decide to move to Argentina instead of Brazil or Venezuela or even Colombia, such as Generoso did?
Ah yes, very good question,
Damianos answered, reclining in his chair.
You see, your father's elder sister had emigrated to Buenos Aires already, therefore it was logical for the brothers to move to where their sister was located.
Damianos stopped talking when a young woman brought their plates to the table.
Thank you, señorita,
he said, throwing her a big smile. As the waiter brought the wine, he cracked a smile at Dan. Will there be anything else, gentlemen? He asked in perfect English, which surprised the three companions.
No, nothing, thank you,
Damianos replied, lifting his gaze to the fellow.
But tell me, where did you learn to speak English so well?
My mother is English, senor. She would not let me forget it, and now I'm grateful for it. Very good, Dan said, nodding. But I'm sure you'll need it if you pursue a career in the hostelry industry. Yes, that's what I intend to do, but not here.
What do you mean? Gustavo queried. You mean not in this hotel?
No, senor, not even in this city. I am intending to move to Venezuela in a couple of months. I figure I will have a better chance to climb the ladder in hotel management in Caracas than I would do here.
Why would that be? Buenos Aires seemed to be a very modern and vibrant city.
Oh, yes, it is, senor. But there are many established families here, and it's very modern, but it's still cold in the winter. The tourists much prefer staying where it's warm on their vacation.
I agree, that would be important, yes, Gustavo agreed. I couldn't imagine spending any vacation where it's pouring rain every day.
Anyway, gentlemen, don't let me keep you, the young man said. Enjoy your meal, he added as he walked away from the table. Silence fell between the three men as they ate their meal until Dan said, It's quite interesting, though, to see the huge gap between the rich and poor there is. He was eating with appetite. He loved good cuisine, and this meal was certainly well prepared. Either you're very rich or you're downtrodden poor.
Exactly, Dan, and this is a disease affecting most of the South American countries for the past 2 centuries at least. Whether Venezuela was a progressive country at the time, the imbalance between wealth and poverty was present, but still is, I'm afraid.
And, of course, this sort of gap between two extremes invites corruption, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, Dan, but we're not here to analyse the political malaise inflicting the continent. We are here to relive the past lives of 2 of the most prominent Ricciulli ancestors.
There is something that just popped into my mind, Damianos, Dan said.
Oh, and what's that?
Well, I heard you mention that my father and my uncle Franco were very young when the family moved to Argentina.
Yes. Well, they were not exactly children either. Arnaldo, your father, was about 16 years old, and your father was 21. But do go on. What was your question?
I was wondering if I was ever to relive the life of a child, or is that something that does not happen?
Oh, it does happen, Dan. Reliving one's past lives is not restricted to adult ancestors or even strangers that have contributed to procreation or continuance of your lineage. Many people relive the life of a child without any problem. Yeah, I seem to remember a woman in Scotland who relived the life of her grandmother as a child, Gustavo commented. I even think her story hit the media big time. Yes, and many experiences such as yours, Dan, are not uncommon, but most people will not talk about what they went through for one reason or another.
I think people are generally afraid of being ridiculed, Damianos, Dan said after swallowing a mouthful. And if I were ever to recount what we've been doing for these past few weeks to anyone, the person would think I'm completely crazy, fit to be tied.
Too true, Dan, but the French expression dejà vu remains in our vocabulary these days because the experience of reliving a past life or seeing something twice without prior recall is very frequent. But it's often referred to as impression of dejà vu, isn't it? Yes, Gustavo, Damianos said. And that's because you can't explain the phenomenon any other way. Your memory of the place, the incident or event is a blur until you delve into the subject or the cause of your vision.
In the morning, after breakfast, Dan and Gustavo made their way to a construction site where Damianos was waiting for them. They were wondering what to expect. Damianos greeted them and handed them each a toolbox. With a snap of his fingers, the two men were now much younger and dressed in working clothes. He then pointed to the construction foreman, saying, "His name is Archibald and he's waiting for you." When Dan tried arguing that he didn't know the first thing about construction, Damianos replied it was about time he learned.
"Besides, you know the trade already. You'll see. Remember, it's all a déjà vu. You've done this job before."
By the end of the day, Dan and Gustavo were tired, of course, but what probably bothered them the most were the blisters in their hands. They hadn't had time to grow calluses yet. Upon returning to the hotel, they found Damianos waiting for them once again in front of the door. Dan and Gustavo looked at each other and wondered what it meant.
"Perhaps I should have told you that you two are now living in a small attic above one of the stores downtown, in a walking distance of your workplace." "What about bathing and eating?" Gustavo queried, wondering if he and Dan were now destined to become close and personal with the abrios of Argentina. "I think you'll find everything in order in that regard, Gustavo," Damianos answered. "I am not that bad of a cook when I set my mind to it."
"You mean you're going to live with us in a small attic?" Dan asked, eyebrows raised. "That's going to be comfy."
"A cat hardly takes any room," Damianos remarked, chuckling.
"Well, what about our sister? Aren't we supposed to live with her?" Dan asked.
"You did, but you two first arrived in Argentina, but as you became accustomed to your new life and managed to find a job with Archibald, you, Arnaldo," he looked at Dan, "decided to fly your own wings and find somewhere closer to the construction site where you two would be working for a time."
Damianos had been right. The attic in question wasn't small at all. In fact, one could have compared it to a spacious loft. It was sparsely furnished, but comfortable nonetheless. Damianos had already prepared a scrumptious meal, and a bottle of the best Argentinian wine was standing proud in the middle of the wooden table.
"And you call that a small attic?" Gustavo said, admiring the pleasantly decorated room. "It's palatial compared to some of the apartment or studios I've lived in when I rented a place in Florida." "I just wanted you to have a nice surprise after a long day's work."
"That's very nice of you, Damianos, and thank you for preparing the meal. It smells great."
"Well, it wasn't difficult, when you have all the fresh meat and vegetables you need near at hand," Damianos answered. "But do tell us, why would Arnaldo and Franco want to leave the country? They had family here, and not such a bad future judging from the looks of this place,"
Gustavo asked, looking around him again. Damianos smiled as he brought the plates from the oven to the table.
"As I said, Arnaldo was already a determined young man. He wanted to make his own way in life. There was a lot of friction between him and his elder sister. She was a little bit of a controlling woman, which didn't sit very well with Arnaldo, as you can imagine. Besides which, they received a letter from their sister in Italy saying that husband needed a helping hand in Caracas. There was a lot of work in the construction industry, apparently."
Damianos paused and sat down.
"The bathroom is behind you," he added, pointing to the door along the far wall.
Dan served the wine after he and Gustavo came back from washing their hands and faces. After Damianos had served himself of some pasta and meat, he went on.
"So Arnaldo and Franco worked in Argentina for as long as it took to save enough money to travel to Caracas. There was no stopping you already, Dan. If you remember your early days in Florida, your determination to make it big, or at least to regain the social standing and the money you saw slip through your fingers when your father lost his fortune, was in your genes. Your father made it the same way you did, with perseverance and willfulness."
If anyone had gone up to the loft the next morning, they would have found it empty. There was no trace of Dan, Gustavo, and Damianos' passage. Time had erased their presence from everyone's memory.